Welcome to my podcast, Why Didn't Anyone Tell Me This? With my guests, we are discussing reproductive health issues and questions you may have about your health. And it's a very great pleasure today to speak to Jody Day about childlessness. Jody is founder of Gateway Women, the global advocacy network for childless women founded in 2011. She's the author of what many professionals consider to be the go-to book on the topic, Living the Life Unexpected: How to Find Hope, Meaning and Fulfilling Future and a fulfilling future without children. Chosen as one of the BBC's 100 women in 2013 and as a UK Digital Woman of the Year in 2021, she's a global thought leader on female involuntary childlessness, a psychotherapist, a 2017 and 2022 TEDx speaker, a founding and former member of the UK charity Aging Well Without Children, and a former fellow in social innovation at Cambridge Judge Business School. Wow, what a list of wonderful attributes. As I said, she's often referred to as the founder of the childless movement, and she's been an ambassador for World Childless Week since its inception in 2017. And since 2018, she has lived in rural Ireland. We've just been discussing, and she's been describing her wonderful location. I am very, very jealous. And she's been working there on 2 new books and nurturing Emerging Gateway Elder Women project, which includes developing local, non-kin, intergenerational support networks for those aging without children. After a lifetime in London, since 2018, living in West Cork, she is now completing a novel and working on this great work. Welcome, Jody, and thank you very much for joining me on this podcast.
Welcome, Joyce. I mean, not welcome, Joyce. Hello, Joyce. It's lovely to be here. After so many interactions over email and whatnot over the years, it's lovely to sort of be in the same room.
It is. You have been the go-to person for me with anything we wanted to discuss over the years about childlessness, obviously. So it's really great to have you on this podcast. And this is the last podcast in this series about motherhood. And we've discussed all different ways of having children, but it was absolutely essential, I felt, to talk about not having children. Now, as we've said, you filled a really important gap for women experiencing childlessness, and there's been no one there to support you when you went through your journey, but now you support so many. So can we start with you sharing your personal journey and how it led you to become an advocate and support figure for childlessness?
Oh, thank you. I mean, if I go back into the mists of time. I think very briefly, growing up, I grew up in a very unhappy family. I'm the unmothered daughter of an unmothered daughter. So kind of growing up, family life didn't really look that appealing. And I think I made a sort of an internal decision quite young not to have children because of my upbringing. But it wasn't really, obviously, an adult or thought through in any way thing. It was just a reaction to what I was, experiencing around me. And so kind of I launched into adult life thinking that that would be my path. I didn't know about the term child free or know anyone. Probably had I known about it, I might have identified as that. And maybe that might have even changed the course of my life, but I didn't. I did get pregnant. I had an unplanned pregnancy when I was 20, and I was with a lovely guy, and he was very supportive. But I was absolutely terrified of becoming a mother because I thought I would mother as I had been mothered. And I was just I was too traumatized to do that. So I did have an abortion at the time. And, to be honest, my mum was very supportive of me having an abortion because, having me as an unplanned pregnancy as a teenager and this is a quote, had ruined her life. So, it's not like, having you was the most meaningful thing that's ever happened to me or anything. She actually was with me at the abortion clinic. So there was a very strong sense of kind of children aren't a great idea. So I carried on through my 20s. That guy and I split up. And then I was actually 22 when I met the man I would later go on to marry at 26. Told him I didn't think I wanted to have children. He was like, okay. And then at 29, having been part of his kind of loving, dysfunctional, large bohemian English family for several years. He was one of 6. I'm an only child. I began to realize that maybe family could mean something different than my own experience of growing up. And I came to realize that actually I did want to have children with him. And so I said, I'd like to have children. And luckily for me, he was like, okay, these huge decisions that can derail relationships for us were actually fairly straightforward. I started trying to conceive. Nothing happened. A couple of years later, I went for fertility investigations. I had an operation called a laparoscopy, where they basically send a camera in through your tummy button to have a look around. And the very avuncular Harley Street gynecologist said, finest uterus I've seen all week. You lovely young people just go off and have lots more sex. That was it.
Wow.
It was the end of the fertility advice we got. I was 33. I'd been trying to conceive for 4 years. And, my hormones checked out fine. My then husband's hormones checked out fine. There was no physical damage that they could see from the abortion. So that wasn't it. And we were sent on our way. I then proceeded to spend the rest of my 30s in what I called baby mania. We were one of the first couples in our social group to get married, but gradually everyone around us started having children whilst we were still trying. My then husband, unfortunately, who was a rather big, glamorous character when I married him, the glamour sort of became workaholism, and the work and being a big drinker, that sort of tipped over into alcoholism and then tipped over into cocaine abuse. And by the time we were I was in my late 30s, we were running an interior design practice together because I'd given up my business in PR thinking I would invest in his business in interior design because his business would be the one that would support our family once I'd had children. So, all of these kind of unconscious decisions were made, and conscious. But we got to I think I was 37 and a half. And one day he said to me, I think we should try IVF. And at that moment, I just had this awful, awful awareness that I did not want to bring a baby into the mess that our marriage had become, because behind the scenes, I was holding everything together. I was holding the business together. I was holding all of the secrets of his addictions from family, from friends, from clients. It was terrible. And having grown up in chaos, I just was like, I can't do this. So in a way, it's kind of looking back on it. I mean, I made an incredibly maternal decision, not to go forward at that point. But that did lead me about 6 weeks later into having, thanks to Brené Brown, what I would describe as a nervous breakdown / spiritual awakening. And I was propelled also by baby mania out of that marriage of 16 years very, very fast, because I thought I still had time to meet someone else and do IVF. And all I knew about IVF was that it always worked, because that's all I'd ever read about it. I'm of the generation where I got no fertility education at school at all, apart from how easy it was to get pregnant and how children ruin your life, because they were just so determined in the 70s to kind of turn back the tide of teenage pregnancies, which they did. But they gave a lot of erroneous impressions about, I was told not to sit on a warm chair if a boy had vacated it. There was this idea that, you could just get pregnant so easily. And perhaps as teenagers, that's more likely, but certainly as we get older, that's not the case. So I actually didn't know that the reason I thought I had to worry about the age 40, I didn't even know why. I didn't know that my eggs aged. I didn't know that at 33, when I've been trying to conceive for nearly 4 years, that we should do more investigations. I didn't know that the clock was running out on I literally didn't know that. So, why didn't anyone tell me this is a big part of my story. The lack of fertility education was really crucial for my generation. I'm 60, by the way, so I'm a sort of very, very early Gen Xer. So I stumbled through the next few years. I had a couple of post-divorce relationships. Neither of those were right to even try IVF in. I still didn't know how unlikely it would have been to have worked at my age and with my fertility history. And then I got to 44 or 44 and a half. And that second post-divorce relationship broke down. Unfortunately, I was with someone with a lot of narcissistic tendencies. So it was a pretty traumatic relationship. And then I realized this is it. It's game over for me. I didn't know anything about donor eggs at that time, but actually, even if I had known, it wouldn't have made any difference. I was 44 and a half, single, broke. I didn't own any property anymore. I didn't have I was self-employed. I was not in any position to become a solo mother by choice, even had I wanted to, which was why when people used to say, why don't you just adopt? It was extraordinary. I mean, because if I said to people I was thinking of getting a dog, they'd say, well, who's going to look after it in the daytime? Yet people kept suggesting to me that I should just have a baby on my own, as if somehow there was support around me to make that possible. So that is when I became childless, and I fell into a pit of grief. I didn't know it was grief. I thought it was depression or despair, or I didn't know. I tried everything I could that I knew about, read every book, but I spoke, Dr. Google, therapists. Nobody really could seem to help why I couldn't find my way out of a depth of despair that it's actually quite hard to bring back into my mind because it was so profound. I mean, I would be driving along the motorway in my car, and I would have fantasies that if I just twitched the wheel of my car into the path of a lorry, it could all be over. So there was just the depth of pain I was in just did not feel survivable for the rest of my life. It's like I didn't really have plans to take my life, but I had fantasies. I just wanted it to be over. It was so painful. Then I started my training to become a psychotherapist during this time. And I was actually, I think, in the second year of my training, and we were doing a course on working with bereavement. And we were introduced to a very classic grief model, the one that most people have heard of, called The 5 Stages of Grief by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And as we were going through this course, it was like a weekend course, I was thinking, this feels very familiar. And I went home and I mapped out what I'd been learning against my experience of not having children. And it was like, oh my God, I'm grieving. There's actually a word for this. And it was really probably one of the most profound turning points of my life, because I realized 2 things. Number one, I wasn't going crazy, because for anyone who has experienced grief, and if we haven't experienced yet, unfortunately, we will at some point. The internal cognitive and emotional world of grief is quite crazy making and strange. It operates on a different way to our normal consciousness. I also knew that if this was grief, that meant that somehow, I didn't know how, that it was a process, and that one day I was going to be on the other side of it. And that kind of gave me the first glimpse of hope that I might one day feel like myself again. And that was in 2011. I had just started writing my blog, Gateway Women. And then I started writing and talking about grief. It was like the whole world just kind of went, what? And jumped in there. And it's still to this day, a lot of people find out they're grieving through my work. And also a lot of people who have found out about grief through my work have gone on to create their own support networks, their own books, their own projects. It's now not so much of a surprise as it used to be. So that's kind of how it all started.
Wow. What a journey. There's so many things I want to pick up there. And you may have heard me say that when I started working in this field, I'm just a bit older than you, but when I started working in this field, we didn't know anything. I'd been to university, I'd done 2 degrees in biochemistry and pharmacology. And I started working in the fertility field, and I was like, wow, I knew none of this. And exactly why didn't I know this before? And hearing your story, I feel really frustrated with one thing in my career, and that was I did start wanting to work on education, on reproductive health education at that time, and that was 1987. And I started writing a book about it, but I mean, it was very different in the 80s. We weren't discussing any of this stuff. And I shelved it, and decades disappeared, and now it seems the right time. But I am frustrated for myself included, all those people where, I feel that if I'd have done it then, we might have been in a different place. But anyway, we can't go back. But Jody, you brought up child-free, the term child-free, and people do get confused about these words. So we've got child-free and childless. So what are the differences between the two?
Well, child-free is generally taken to mean child-free by choice. So it applies to a person, a man or a woman, or a non-binary person who has chosen not to be a parent. Childless is usually meant childless, not by choice, or involuntary childlessness, where someone has wanted to be a parent and for whatever reason it hasn't worked out. The statistics about, I mean, number one, I think the idea of it being sort of two buckets is really unhelpful. I think it's actually a spectrum. And actually, we may move around it and identify differently at different points in our life. For example, internally, having integrated my grief over my childlessness, I think I feel as at peace inside as if I had chosen it. But I'll never know because I can't completely live those two experiences. But also, I call myself childless out of respect, both for the journey I've been on to get to this place, also to show that there's nothing to be shameful about using the word childless, because child-free is a bit groovier. But it's like, no, I'm childless. It's just a description, there's nothing shameful about it. But also out of respect to those people who have made a conscious choice, whose internal journey has been different from those of us for who is involuntary. But we do move around that spectrum, and the numbers, the qualitative data is hard to come by. It used to be I used to quote 6 to 10% of people were child-free by choice. Around 10 to 15% were childless due to infertility. The rest were childless by circumstance. Some recent data that came out from the Pew Research Center in the US in July 2024, for the first time, as well as surveying people 18 to 49, they included those 50 plus, and they were asking them retrospectively about their choices and their decisions and their experiences. And that showed up that 33% of them had chosen to be childless. So that, but it varies in every single study. But not only do I think it's perhaps higher than we've known before, that also might mean that those people might have called themselves childless at an early point in their journey. And now looking back, they can see it's a choice. It changes over time. But also, I think we are seeing and will continue to see a big increase in the number of young people who are choosing not to have children for lots of complex reasons. Our society is not making it easy to have children and bring up a family. We've created a world that makes it incredibly hard to do for lots of reasons, including systemic reasons, not just fertility, but relationships, housing, economics, politics, and the climate.
Yeah, and I feel a bit frustrated as well that we don't have more accurate numbers about those that are choosing and those that have circumstance. I would like to see how this is evolving, because we hear that 20% of women in the UK and USA don't have children when they're past reproductive age, but we don't really know how many. You had some figures there, but as you said, it is a spectrum, and there are women I've interviewed who have said they always knew they wanted to be a mother, and it was always the primary thing for them. But even I have I had a time in my 20s when my partner said he wasn't ready. Then I told everyone for a few years, I don't want children. I'm not going to have children. And I've met so many people who have said that. So it does vary, as it did for you. It can vary between people. And in your book, so your book is hard to read. It brings up so many important topics, but I absolutely, for anyone in this situation, I think it is definitely the go-to book. And you talk about 50 ways not to be a mother, and I wonder if we could explore some of these. So you talk about obviously child-free by choice, as you said, but then childless because of infertility, but there's so many other reasons. So don't go through all 50, but they make interesting reading. You have to buy the book. But tell us what sort of differences can be certainly childless because of either infertility or other social reasons. As you've mentioned about relationships, many women find it hard to find a partner.
Yeah, and just to that point, if you download the free introduction to my book, which you'll find on my website, it includes the 50 ways not to be a mother section, so you can read that. And I think being single not by choice is probably the biggest reason. I mean, there's some data coming out around that now. I mean, that was one of the biggest reasons. I think it was 31 or 33% in the Pew study for people who had wanted children. It was that they hadn't found a suitable partner. You know, that is huge. I mean, in the UK, I think singleness, I mean, the UN calls it not married or in a union, has gone up 70% since 1970. And I've got some data here, and this is UK data. So the average age of the mother at first birth is now 31 in the UK.
Yeah.
And singleness in that cohort, so 30 to 34, has increased 300% since the 1970s. So, you know, from 9% to 35%. So we are looking at, you know, those who are sort of 30 to 34, there's about 35% of them single, 45 to 49, about 29%. So we're looking at roughly 30% of the female population is unmarried or not in a union. It's very kind of antiquated words. I mean, this is a massive social change we're living through, in that, there were opportunities available to me and to those younger than me that were not there perhaps for our mother's generation. We are expecting different things from our relationships, and we are struggling to find them. And the amount of singleness that's gone up is also reflected, it seems, in the male population too. And that can often be a reason that men aren't having children. There was a fascinating study that's only just come out showing that partnership formation is one of the main reasons that men are childless, not by choice as well. So we're looking at like a massive change in dating and mating. I mean, I often call my generation, sort of the Gen X generation, you know, the shock absorbers for the sexual revolution. It's like there are so many unintended consequences that we're still working through as a society for such a massive transformation. And both voluntary and involuntary childlessness is one of them. And it completely, you know, scares the very heteronormative conservative forces that be. I mean, we've only got to look at kind of the whole sort of J.D. Vance childless cat ladies thing. It's like, it doesn't really matter what the social problem is, you know, let's just blame women. I mean, when my mum had me at 18 out of wedlock in 1960s, the thing that everyone was terrified of was unwed mothers. Now it's childless cat ladies, but it always seems to be women's fault, whatever the social problem is.
Yeah, it's so interesting because people often say, "Oh, well, it's financial. It's because we don't support people." But but as you said, it is much more complex. So Sweden, that I was using as an example, that's got such a great financial support system, but they're still seeing the age of first birth going up. Childless women, the same numbers. So as you said, you know, there's so many things. There's career. You know, so many women now want a career, and I think companies try to be supportive, but we all know those stories about women when they go back after maternity leave. It's not. It's really difficult to do, and there's obviously medical reasons and social reasons. And in your book, you have so many stories of women that they've told you about their journeys. Was there one or two that you might want to share about the reasons why there are blocks to trying to have a child in today's society?
Well, I think structural reasons are probably the biggest. I mean, we have created a kind of an economic system where it does take two salaries to support a family. So when you say, you know, lots of women want a career, well, sort of wanting a job, you know, having a job is no longer an optional thing. I mean, I do remember when I was growing up, it was, you know, certainly for middle class women, you know, having a job was like, it was something you did if you felt like it and your husband let you, you know, but it was not integral to the family finances in the way it's always been for, you know, for working class families. It was different. But now it's like everyone has to work. So actually that, you know, that structural difference, as you say, you know, trying to combine getting to a point in your career where you can take a break is difficult. And that obviously makes you get older. Biologically, your fertility gets older. That's tough. There's also the issues around maybe meeting a partner who's already had children, or who doesn't want more, or doesn't want children at all. There are lots of, I think ambivalence is a really important one to talk about. I mean, I was ambivalent. I obviously both did and didn't want to have children. And that's a hard one to discuss, because there is pronatalism kind of gives this idea that wanting to be a mother is the most natural thing in the world to do. Therefore, if you're not sure if you want children or not, there's actually something fundamentally wrong with you as a person, as a woman. Where in actual fact, if we think about it, the pill is 60 years old. The opportunity for women in the West to do things other with their lives than perhaps only be wives and mothers these are all very, very new choices. And I think the choice to decide, because we have birth control, that this is the moment I want to have children, or I definitely want to have children. We've had millions of years of evolution. We've only had 60 years in the West of really being able to think these through. We barely have a language. And I think that actually ambivalence, and I call it in my book, I call it compassion and intelligence in action. We're really thinking through, not just, is this the right moment? Am I the right kind of person to have a family? Can I really offer children what I believe children deserve? Can I create that safe and nurturing environment? Can I give enough of myself? Do I have enough of myself to give? And I think these are actually profoundly important questions that women often are asking of themselves. And rather than ambivalence being shamed, I'd love to see more people who are having children thinking about these things. A lot of babies come into the world without their parents being ready, perhaps psychologically or financially. And it would be lovely if we could actually spend more time thinking about parenthood, as well as fertility education, really making it okay to think through these choices. And there can be so many other reasons. Chronic illness is a massive reason. I mean, if you are struggling to manage a chronic illness and the energy and the procedures and everything that might be involved in that, that can be a real obstacle. That can also be a mental condition. Perhaps you have to come off medication in order to get pregnant. If you're bipolar or you have another condition, and that's unwise. You might have a genetic history, which means perhaps it's unwise. You may be a parentified child or a child carer, someone who arrives at adulthood already having carried the burden of so much care for younger siblings that you're done. And you think that that's it. And then you arrive maybe at 40 or 45 and go, maybe you've done a bit of therapy or you've done a bit of healing around it. And it's like, that stole parenthood from me as well as my childhood. So it can be so complex. So it can be the outside world, it can be structural, it can be not meeting the right partner at the right time who has the same intentions, or it can be deeply internal and personal things going on. And I think it wasn't part of my thinking around, the state of the world, but it is a huge issue now for young people. It's a moral issue. Is it really morally acceptable for me to bring another human being into a climate emergency and possibly, whatever you want to call it, westernized civilization is going through a dark night of the soul. No one really knows what's going to happen in the next 50 years. And obviously human beings have never known that. But I don't think we've possibly ever known how much we don't know. You know what I mean, right now, and the possible outcomes one can paint depending on, your belief systems and your information sources, can be pretty apocalyptic. But then some people will say, well, the world has always been ending. And people have always continued to have babies, in the West, in both of the world wars, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, during so many things, people have still carried on having babies. So you can cut it just about any way in terms of how you want to think about this. But the reasons people don't have children, I could have made that list 100.
Yeah.
And also it's not just one reason. It's a bit like a sort of, a menu for a takeaway. You can say, well, I've got a bit of 1, a bit of 5, a bit of 49. I mean, I've got about 5 or 6 of those that constellate around why it happened for me. It's such a nuanced topic, but unfortunately the media and mainstream culture still thinks it's two reasons. Didn't want them, couldn't have them. End of story.
Yeah, and we've asked young people. We've done a survey of young people, asking them about their attitudes and knowledge around reproduction, and we've done it in different countries. And across the countries, it comes out at about 65% say they do want to have children. So these are 16 to 18-year-olds, and the rest, some say no, and some say they're not sure. So it's interesting I want to keep that data and repeat it in different countries and every sort of 5 years to see how that changes. But so we've talked about the fact that we do have a choice in the Western world. We've had with a pill for 60 years, as you said. We've been able to take control of our fertility, but there are some cultures where not having a child is really stigmatized. So I've met people that basically said, unless they had a child, and for some, unless they had a boy, they would in their social network, in their community, they would be stigmatized. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly even, we can think about some societies within India, some cultures within India, where a woman, if a couple is unable to have children, it is presumed to be the woman's fault. Her husband might take another wife, and she may become like a sort of slave in her own home or be thrown out. So it can be very, very extreme, and that can happen in Africa as well, in certain African cultures. In the UK, those members of our society that are part of perhaps South Indian communities, there is still an incredibly strong drive, pronatalist drive to have children, and it can be extremely difficult to kind of continue to be a respected member of that community if you don't have children. Certainly, I don't know if you've had Regeshri Dairywan on your podcast, who is a childless, not by choice British doctor. She's fascinating on this topic too. She's quoted in my book. Yeah. But I think wherever you live.
Carry on.
No, it's fine.
Yeah, so it's very, very complex if we look at globally at this, for sure. I wanted to delve a bit more into those that went through fertility treatment. I know that wasn't your particular journey, but we've been talking a lot about this. I know in your book you talk about how our fertility declines, as you said at the start, not understanding really about the biological clock. And with fertility treatment, I think one of the difficult things is knowing when to stop. And I did a survey of men and women who were childless and past reproductive age quite a few years ago. And they said that the biggest reason for stopping was emotional rather than financial. Even though in the UK, we obviously have the financial problem as well. So what advice would you give people that are coming to the end of their journey with fertility treatment and it's not working and they have to try and have closure? That's such a complicated one. I know many go on and on way beyond this. Have you got any advice for them?
Well, first of all, although it hasn't been my personal experience, over the last 13 years, I've probably spoken or interacted with 10 or 15,000 childless women. So I kind of am the vault of an awful lot of other women's stories. And I have really learnt from them about the experience of childlessness after infertility treatments. And you're right, that deciding to stop, it usually sort of gets decided for you, as in you can't go on physically, emotionally, financially, relationally. There's usually a point where you kind of hit the buffers and you are encouraged to keep going till that point, because pronatalism makes out that you will become a parent at all costs. You cannot give up, because it is this idea that is kind of, the childlessness is like, it's like the bogeyman in the room. I think of us as the sort of the dark fairy at the christening, the one that no one wants to kind of acknowledge, that gets forgotten at the christening. And in a way, one of the difficulties is that, I mean, my experience when I was trying to conceive is I never, ever, ever gave a moment's thought to what would happen if it didn't happen for me. Because I was just focused all my energy, my hopes, my beliefs, my dreams about becoming a mother. So when I didn't become a mother, there was like this huge vacuum as well, because it can be really hard to look at childless role models, to imagine a childless life when you're trying to conceive, because it's like, it's the thing you don't want to acknowledge, is that this is a very real possibility. And if you're doing fertility treatments, unfortunately, probably the most likely possibility, if it's a first pregnancy, is that you're going to end up childless. But the fertility industry, and I call it an industry, doesn't really hold space for that. You know, it is kind of the shadow. I mean, I gave a talk to, I gave a keynote at the Australian and New Zealand Fertility Society last year. And I also, you know, which was 800 fertility professionals, you know, from professors and therapists and everyone else. And I really talked about the moral injury, actually, to professionals sometimes working in that world, of not allowing space for the chance, you know, for the outcomes where people don't go home with a baby, and how hard that is for them. So I think there's a lot we need to do within the industry and within the professions to hold space for the possibility of an outcome not being successful. Whereas, I mean, just if I go back for like 10 years or more, there was a fertility counsellor working in a big London clinic, and it was just after Gateway Women had started. And she invited me in for a meeting. She said, "It's amazing what you're doing. It's so important. It's so needed. And it's really important that your work's not affiliated with any clinic or anything like that. I kind of love to get you in, maybe to give a talk to the clinicians and everyone." Anyway, she took this idea to the clinic, and they said, "We cannot have anything to do with her. We cannot be aligned in any way whatsoever with failure. You are not allowed to give out any information or put up any information about this woman anywhere within the clinic." You know, it's like, we cannot be aligned with failure. And it was a real mind-blowing opening for me, how unwelcome, childlessness is. And I won't say her name, but you'll know her. She continued to recommend me, but like word of mouth, because most women and couples are leaving clinics without any guidance about how to live the rest of their lives, without the thing that they thought was going to fill the rest of their lives. It is cruel beyond measure. And, you know, an exit counselling session from a clinic, that's not enough. A lot of clients don't even take it up because they want out of there. But yet, you know, maybe a follow-up call. Here are some resources you might want to explore. The lack of post-treatment care for people leaving treatment without a baby is criminally cruel. So, you know, yes, those people making that decision, they're usually making it because they can't not make it. You know, they're not necessarily making a free choice. They've come up as again, you know, against something they can't go on. But how do we take care of them, and how do we show them that women like me, who are their worst dream come true at that point, you know, that actually you can have a meaningful and fulfilling life without children? It's just not the one that the mainstream has showed you. It's also not one you can imagine yet. You have to grieve your losses, you know, and during that process of grieving your losses, your identity will shift, and you will start to realize what might be important to you instead. But for the rest of your life, you will be seen as less valuable as a human being than a woman who's had children. You know, so you have to make a big adjustment. You get kicked out of the status quo when you don't have kids, whether it's by choice or not by choice. So you really need other people who've made that journey in order to teach you how to cope, and also how to find a new locus of internal value other than motherhood or fatherhood.
I'm very shocked about what you've just said about the fertility clinic. I had assumed that you would be, and Gateway Women, which we'll talk about in a minute, would be in all clinics, and that when someone had someone or a couple had decided they were going to stop treatment, that they would refer them to you. Does that not happen?
Maybe it happens now. This was a decade ago, but I should imagine it's still pretty covert. I mean, the British Infertility Counsellors Association, which is the body that basically sort of infertility counsellors belong to in the UK, I've kind of spoken at their conferences a few times. And I think if you were to be recommended to one of their, to one of them, they would probably know about my work. But it's a far from straightforward recommendation. And a lot of people who find Gateway Women, one of the things that is the most common thing that people say is, I wish I had found you years ago. It's very, very sad.
That is very sad. And I think, and I've spoken about this a number of times on my podcast, that I think that certainly going through a fertility journey or infertility journey, depending which way you look at it, I think it is very stressful. And we've talked about trauma and having PTSD, whether you have a child or not from it. It is a very, very traumatic thing to go through. And this, your body failing and not producing a pregnancy when, as you said, you see everyone around you just getting pregnant so easily and you're not. And then, as you've talked about grief, so for those that have tried to get pregnant or wanted to get pregnant and then for whatever reason didn't, it's absolutely grief. And I feel very strongly that everyone in any of these situations does need some professional advice and treatment, if you like, with someone like you, to help get through that and totally reorganize their thinking of their life and move forward. But they need help. They need professional help. You can't deal with this on your own. I just can't see how you could do that successfully. It's very hard to do that, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, grief is a social emotion. It is part of love. Grief is the emotion that arises when something we love, is irrevocably gone from our life and our consciousness. And people will say, well, you can't grieve childlessness. You can't grieve something you didn't have. It's like, oh, you can. Oh, you absolutely can. I mean, childlessness is a form of what's called disenfranchised grief. So it's a grief which is not socially acknowledged, socially acceptable, about which you're not allowed to talk and you're not allowed to ask for support around it. So it's basically really pushed out into the shadows. There are other forms of disenfranchised grief as well. For example, the first one that was identified was grieving the death of an ex-spouse. So someone will, it's like, well, why are you upset? You split up years ago. This is, that's one where people will go, basically the message is, you can't be feeling what you're feeling. So if you imagine that's the response when you try to talk about it, there is no support available for you. So you have to find others who have had the same experience or very similar, who will then be able to discuss it with you. Because grief, there's grief and there's mourning. Now, mourning is a social part of grief. We mourn in community. So that's why online communities, like the one I started, 12 years ago, and many others that have sprung up since, are so important, because we can come together with other people who understand what it is to not be a parent when you had really, really dreamed of it, and the journey it takes to come through that. And with support, we can get through this. But if you're left on your own in your bedroom, no one will let you talk about it without what I call bingos, which is a term I got from the child-free community, which will be, you can't really grieve. Oh, children aren't all they're cracked up to be. Oh, you dodged a bullet. Oh, have one of mine. Oh, you're so lucky you get to sleep in and travel. Oh, are you still not over that yet? Are you malingering? All of these things. It's like, we actually, in the end, we often choose to self-silence, because the responses we get are so shaming. And then we might take that story into therapy and hear the same in slightly better therapeutic language, because actually the therapeutic profession is also fundamentally pronatalist as well, and doesn't really understand involuntary childlessness. There's a little bit more understanding around, the child-free choice, because that's kind of
Yeah.
groovy and modern. But really interestingly, childlessness exists in the shadow because it doesn't fit the modern neoliberal feminist idea that if you want something, you can have it. As you and I know, fertility doesn't necessarily respond to it. You can be a good person, you can have the cash, you can make the right choices, you can try really hard, you can do many, many things. It doesn't necessarily work. And that really doesn't fit our idea as agents of control. It shows us that life isn't always under our control. Fertility, menopause, aging, death, all the things I love talking about, deeply unpopular.
So let's talk now about your work, and anybody listening to this that feels that they need to come and talk to someone, please, you're the person to talk to. But you started with your blog in 2011 when you took the brave step to tell your story, really, when people weren't being so open about these journeys then. And then you started Gateway Women, and one thing I wanted to ask you about Gateway Women first, and you do lots of workshops and obviously help women going through this. Why did you call it Gateway Women? I've read your Substack and I know, but Gateway Women is an interesting one.
Yeah, it was, as the kids say, it was a bit of a download. I was doing a workshop with Nick Williams for kind of heart-based entrepreneurs, and I created this project called the Gateway Project. And really it was about, when I reflected back on it, it was about something which has always fascinated me, even since I was a child, which is about transitions. And a gateway, in a way, a gate can be in your way. It can be something you're prevented from, but it's also a threshold. It's the marker of a liminal space between one state and another. And I've always been fascinated by those in my writing, and sort of psychologically, when I worked as an under 18s kind of psychotherapist, I adored working with adolescents. I loved the threshold they were passing through, how one moment they were quite childlike and another moment they could be almost incredibly adult, how they were a mixture of the both and they were trying to work both out. And one of the schools I worked in, they called me the teenage boy whisperer, because I was really good at working with boys who were just about to be kicked out and weren't really talking to anyone about anything. So I love this idea of a threshold. And like I said, becoming, not becoming a mother, big threshold. Menopause, aging, death, perhaps. In a way, birth and death are the big thresholds that, that bookmark our human experience. So Gateway, it was a lucky thing that I called it that. It didn't have the word childless in it, which has been really helpful for a lot of people. And now with Gateway Elder Women, once again, it's like I'm back at the thresholds again. Yeah. And it's interesting you said I was brave, to kind of tell my story. I didn't realize I was being brave. I used my real name, my real photograph, my real story. I was single at the time. I've always been very careful not to tell too much of other people's stories. And I think because I'd been through the 12-step movement, sort of recovering from my codependency related to, my marriage. I was part of a 12-step group called Al-Anon, which is for friends and families of addicts and alcoholics. It goes right through my family line as well, with my mother and my grandmother. So I had kind of learnt the power of peer-to-peer healing. I'd learnt the power of de-shaming ourselves by telling our stories. I think probably thanks to my time in the 12-step movement, I wasn't carrying as much shame about my childlessness as maybe, as often people are. And interestingly, in Ireland, it is much more shameful to be childless than it is in England. So it really, really varies culture to culture. But Yeah, I did kind of buck a trend. I did slightly break the internet at times as well, which was a great surprise to me. But it's been wonderful to bring so many of us together so that we can heal together and, as I say, rise together.
Yeah, I think turning a difficult situation round in a positive way, I think, is a really amazing and beautiful thing to be able to do. And as you say in your book, you never get over childlessness, but you are bringing people together. You're bringing women together. And I'm a big fan of women's circles. And as you've talked about peer-to-peer support and storytelling and sharing our experiences, I think is so powerful. And you are running you're doing lots of great work, but you're running the Gateway Women Reignite weekend workshops. Tell us more about that.
Well, I started those in 2012, and they are healing and transformational weekends for women who are childless not by choice. And it kind of arose out of the combination of being part of the 12-step movement, but also doing my psychotherapy training. And I began to realize that, the power of bringing people together in person for a weekend. So I think the first one was July 2012. I slightly tweaked it after that, but the format has remained almost the same since 2012. I've run it personally 50 or 60 times around the world. I have a team of trained facilitators in Australia and the UK who continue to lead it. It is an extraordinary chance also to come together, because something I realize is that a lot of childless women have lost their feeling of a sense of safety with a group of women. So, they start the weekend. It takes a huge amount of courage to come to one of these weekends, because there's a lot of shame and anxiety about showing up, and a lot of internalized pronatalism that makes out that all of the other childless women in the room will be weeping weirdos, people you wouldn't want to associate with, people you wouldn't want to spend a weekend with. And by the morning coffee break, they've worked out that everyone else in the room is actually kind of brilliant. And that's the beginning of turning, because maybe they're fine too. And everyone hears everyone else's story and begins to see threads. I use it because we sit in a circle, and by the end of that first morning, I can see like threads running across the room between one woman and another. This part of this story resonates with her. This part of this story resonates with her. And it's just this incredible sense of relief where we put down the shame and the judgment and the guilt that we might be carrying and start to connect. So that day one of the Reignite weekend is really about understanding how grief is showing up in our life, understanding how pronatalism and all of the crazy cat lady stories are showing up in our life, looking at those, unpacking them, showing how they don't apply to us, how this is social conditioning. This is a belief system, and we don't have to buy into it. And then on day two, when we come back, it's a completely different day. Everyone's quite high and happy on Sunday morning. It's lovely. Silent on Saturday morning. Can't shut them up on Sunday. And then we do a lot of creative exercises about beginning to get your daydreaming engine working again. Because if your dream has been the dream of motherhood and you've been grieving, your ideas, you might need a little bit of support and courage to have a new dream for your life. I mean, as I say, my old dream nearly killed me. I'm not sure I actually want to have a new dream. Can I just live my life a sort of in black and white and be safe and stay below the radar? To actually encourage women to support each other. Actually, no, you get to choose a different kind of good life. And it doesn't have to be a life that looks amazing to others. Because there is this kind of pronatalism by the back door that says because you don't have children, you have to do something extraordinary with your life. No, you don't. You only have to do something that feels meaningful to you. It might look exactly the same as your life did before, but it feels completely different from the inside. So sometimes childless role models, like me or like Oprah, not that we're normally in the same sentence, can actually have a sort of a bit of a blowback. It's like, well, I'm not going to do anything amazing with my life. You don't have to. If you had had children, would you have thought you had to do this as well? Not that mothers can't do amazing things on top of motherhood. And it's like, no. So why do you think you do? Because you're childless. So we help them to unpack these kinds of negative ideas. And they leave the weekend with potentially new friends for life. Those relationships deepen over the years. I mean, I know women who 10 years on from doing that weekend, still meet once a year, and go for a weekend in the Lake District. They rent a house together. Their partners, if they have them, don't come. Their dogs do. And they have a weekend kind of walking and hanging out in the Lake District. It can be really hard to find community and friendship as a childless woman, because so many of our existing friendships fade away or explode.
I absolutely love this work. Honestly, I love what you're doing. I always, all the work I'm doing, I say to women, peer-to-peer support, find other women, find your tribe who are experiencing what you're experiencing, get support from them. And I've done some work on periods, asking women about periods, their menstruation, and I found the schoolgirls I interviewed actually really, they talk to each other. They have this wonderful camaraderie with the other girls that they're in their friendship group with, and I absolutely loved that. And the at the same time we did the teenage girls, we did a similar project with perimenopausal women. And I couldn't do a podcast without talking about menopause, so we'll get that done now. But I think it was really interesting that many of the women on our focus groups, so they were still having periods, but they were definitely in the perimenopause, so that towards the end of their fertile journey or not. And quite a few of the women had not had children. Some were by choice. The ones by choice felt a bit frustrated now in their sort of late 40s, early 50s, that they'd had all these periods and menstrual cycles all their life, and it was something that they had never intended to make use of. So they felt a little bit frustrated. But then obviously the women who were on the childless journey that had wanted to have children, they realized that they were now at the end of their journey and it wasn't going to happen. So they were a bit frustrated in a different way. And I know you wrote a blog called The Childless Menopause back in 2014, which really was before we were talking about menopause. In the UK now, everyone's talking about menopause, but that's only really happened in the last 5 years. So, how do you feel about women at this perimenopause, menopause stage when they realize it's over?
Well, obviously, each woman's experience is unique, but something I have seen, perhaps less so now because the conversation, as you say, about menopause is really developing in the UK. But what I did see kind of 10 years ago was women arriving at menopause still hopeful because they were having periods that they might still become mothers. And when menopause arrived, when their period stopped, that was, hit an absolute wall of grief. And in that blog you report, and actually in my book as well, I call that for those women, menopause, and actually maybe for all childless women in some way, involuntarily, menopause can be a death you survive, because it is the end of your biological line in an irrevocable way. It is the end of your hopes and dreams of motherhood and possibly grandmotherhood. It is also in our culture, in our patriarchal culture, post-reproductive women, there is no respect or admiration for them. You are not someone's mother, potentially someone's mother. You are really of no use to the patriarchal project at all. You're just a crazy cat lady, a witch, whatever it might be. Unless you are potentially going to be a grandmother one day, grandmother is the only term for women 60 plus that is a compliment. Every single other one is an insult. So that's why I call myself apprentice crone. And actually, having recently turned 60, soon I'll be able to drop the apprentice because I'm moving into my croning years. But I think there's still the grief that can come up at menopause for women who wanted to be mothers is something we really need to allow space for. And people think that they're grieving their looks or their attractiveness or their this, but actually existentially and psychologically and spiritually, there can be something so much deeper going on. And actually the women I know who are post-reproductive or post-potentially reproductive childless women who have been through the dark night of the soul that childlessness can create are actually some of the most profoundly mature, psychologically wise, interesting, empowered women I know. And actually, we are going into aging with our eyes open, because there's an awful lot of kind of the acceptable female identity that we've already lost. We know what it is to survive something you think you can't survive, and to be judged for it, to be judged for not being a mother when it wasn't your choice, and then you get judged for being an older post-reproductive woman. We're all going to age, but we get judged and shamed for it. So there is a certain robustness to those of us who've been around the block being judged about our womanhood, that I think, as there are now so many of us, could really actually help to change the conversation about what it is to become an older woman in our society.
Yes. Oh, you've got me very excited now. So Sharon Blackie's book, Haggitude, talks about the crone, and she has a lovely phrase that we're not elderly, we're the elders, which I love. I'm going to have her on my podcast very soon. And I'm doing a lot of work with women over 50. I've just, on the last few interviews of interviewing 50 women over 50, to write a book. I'm writing a book about, I'm not sure, the title keeps changing, but it probably be called something like Embracing Age or Embracing Your Second Spring. And I think, whether you had children or not, we are at a really new phase that we're really, many people are trying to promote now, about life over 50 or a bit older, maybe, whatever, this post-menopause life for women is just a really new and exciting, and for many women, as you say, their life doesn't need to be, Jessica Hepburn's climbing Everest, etc. It can be whatever makes them content and happy and brings them joy. And I love that comedy series, The Change. I believe they're doing a second series where she realizes she's in the perimenopause and she runs off to the woods. And interestingly, I don't know if you saw it, but she actually tells everyone she's childless. She says she hasn't got a husband, and she does, and she's got 2 children, and she just wants to be the postmenopausal woman. She just wants to be herself. And I think for women postmenopause, finding themselves, so it's irrespective of whether they've had children or not. I really don't think that's relevant to this part of the conversation. It's just finding your authentic self at this incredible time of your life, because we're so much healthier than we were before, that we can have 30 or 40, maybe 50 years post menopause where we can live our best lives ever. So, I think that's something that we really, really need to let women become who they should be. Do you think?
Oh, totally. You're pushing an open door there with me. I'm a big fan of Sharon's work. I'm interviewed in Haggitude, and also she interviewed me on her podcast, the Haggitude podcast. I mean, I think, at 60, I've been postmenopausal for 11 years. And although some of the physical, parts of aging and being postmenopause, I won't lie, I've had a real bitch of a menopause. It hasn't been easy at all. Although, that stuff requires management. I'm more at peace with who I am now than I have been since before puberty. In fact, I think I remind myself of who I was before the hormonal storm of estrogen. I'm courageous. I have a lot of clarity. I'm quite ambitious. I sort of know what I want, and I know what I don't want. And it's been really fascinating trying to work out who this person is and what she wants. And the more women I meet at this stage of life, the ones who have had a chance maybe to integrate their losses, not everyone seeks out that or has an opportunity to do that work. I find them the most extraordinary women. And something you said about maybe being a mother or not being a mother, that perhaps it becomes less important. I am really finding that. I write a very popular Substack called Gateway Elder Women, which is really focused on the experience of, I call it, exploring the adventure of elderhood without motherhood. I have a lot of people who read it who are mothers and grandmothers, because the experiences I'm describing are actually more archetypal and universal than I realized. And I love that. I love the idea that, patriarchy, divide and rule, wants to divide mothers and non-mothers. I think perhaps, as Stella Duffy, who you have to have on the podcast,
Yes.
says,
No, she's a good friend. Yeah.
post-menopausally, we're all infertile. There is this sense that, maybe motherhood or non-motherhood can perhaps become a less defining part of our female identity. Maybe we can find more common cause. I'm finding that, and I'm really excited about that, because one of the things about post-menopause, there's so much you go, wow, I didn't know it was going to be like that,
Yeah.
And we hear a lot about the shit stuff, but there is some good stuff to look forward to.
Yeah, well, Eleanor Mills's book's just come out, and I've interviewed Stella for my book, and Eleanor is I think the last person I'm going to be interviewing. And that I'm so pleased there's so many of us now shouting about this, because almost every day on social media I'm hearing from women saying, oh, my life's a disaster, my post-menopause is disaster, everything's a disaster. We have got to shout about this and make them hear that it doesn't have to be like that. But Susan Saunders, who I've interviewed a couple of times on different things, she said it's in our hands. It is in our hands about how we live this part of our lives. So it is a really wonderful time. We want everyone to have the best lives that they can have, whatever their journey's been before that. I think menopause, for me, I look at it, women have a sort of reset button. No matter what's happened before, we've got a time to think, okay, it's in my hands. What am I going to do now? How do I want to live my life? I feel sorry that men don't have that. They just carry on and they don't have that sort of wake up call to think very carefully about it. So it's great. We've got to all get together and make sure that women are strong and doing what they want to do, not what anyone else wants them to do, what they want to do.
Yeah, and in a way, the invisibility that comes as post-reproductive women, as the male gaze slides away from us, that invisibility, which can be really hard to cope with at times. Letting go of that part of our female identity, that we will turn heads, or that the world of men will make space for us, which it absolutely doesn't as we get older. It's also can be quite a powerful thing as well, because there's a sense that we can fly under the radar a bit more. I'm like, okay, so I have an invisibility cloak. It's also a magical invisibility cloak. I'm up to all kinds of shit underneath there that the status quo doesn't pay attention to. And I love the idea, just as at the end of my first TED talk, I said, maybe there's a reason there are so many of us, women without children in the world at this time. Maybe the world needs us. And I have an idea that as my cohort, the 1960s cohort, of which, maybe 18 to 20% are childless or child-free, as we move into post-menopause, it's like there's this amazing resource. Our lives are not focused around the care of the next generation, even though there may be people that we do care for. It's like we're educated, liberated, and we're not completely tied into the paradigm of care for younger people. Maybe we do a lot of care for elder people. It's like we could cause quite a lot of cultural change, and goodness, we need it. Patriarchy is tired. It's very tired. It's not serving anyone. It's certainly not serving men or the planet. It's like we need a reset. Maybe the whole world needs a menopause.
Watch out, everyone. The postmenopausal women are out.
The postmenopausal posse are coming. Yeah.
Our tribe are here. The last few questions that I ask all my guests. So I've called the podcast, Why Didn't Anyone Tell Me This? I'm really glad I called it that. What have you heard women tell you?
I think for my generation, what I talked about in terms of the lack of fertility education is heartbreaking. I also think what would be lovely, what I wish we'd know, is that actually maybe life without children isn't going to be a disaster. that, I mean, women often, as they start to heal and they're like, if I'd known about you, if I'd known that life without children was going to be possible for me, maybe I wouldn't have been so desperate. Maybe I wouldn't have done this. Maybe I wouldn't have done that. But as we talked about earlier, it seems to be really hard to hold those two awarenesses at the same time. That maybe life without children is going to be okay, and I must do everything to become a mother. So, that, I think that would make a big difference. Basically, if being childless or child-free were unremarkable, it would make such a difference. Yeah.
So I'm trying to develop a UK education support program for those going through menopause, and the format we're doing, I want to do the same thing for women, well, and couples, anyone, for fertility education as well. So I don't know if I've got enough energy in my life to be able to do this, because this is sort of 20 years work. But I'd love it that those who want to try and get pregnant came and did some education and peer support with other people who were trying to get pregnant. And if I did that, having you be a big part of this and talking about it's okay if it doesn't work, being childless is fine, I think that you would be absolutely a major part of this. So they've got to understand all of the eventualities of what they're trying to do at that time. I think it's really, really, really essential. But let's change the last few questions. What makes you happy, Jody, and where is your happy place?
So what makes me happy? I thought about it. Actually, writing makes me happy. It really does. When what it's like, you're a writer and you have a busy life as well. When I finally get that moment, when I get to sit down and do my writing and shape my thoughts, writing is the way I make sense of the world, my interior world and also the world around me. And it always has been. And yeah, writing isn't something I do. A writer is something I am. It's not always about publication. So writing is my happy place. That's what makes me happy. And my happy place is West Cork.
I knew you'd say that.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, my parents split up before I was born, but my father is or was Irish. I've never met him and unable to trace him. But my DNA shows, obviously, that I'm 50% Irish. And then people were starting to say all this stuff about, they were getting all this information from their DNA tests. I thought, I didn't get any of that on mine. So I went back to my DNA test from many years ago, and there's a lot more information in it. And it shows actually where in Ireland my DNA comes from. I am back on my Indigenous land. So
Wow.
I have come home in a really powerful way. I love it here. My personality really fits in here. All my life I've been told I'm too open, I'm too friendly, I'm too this, I'm too the other. I've just been too Irish all along. so I'm very happy here. Yeah.
I'm a quarter Irish, so I think maybe I need to come, and I'm all those things you just said, so I need to be there too. And the swimming, obviously. The very final question: what advice would you give your younger self?
Yeah, I've been reflecting on this, and it's kind of heartbreaking when I look back to the young woman I was and how unmothered and how unsupported she was. I think I would just want to tell her that, the dream of motherhood is not the only dream in town, that she will come through those losses, that she will be as changed by the experience of non-motherhood as the experience of motherhood would have changed her, that she will still be an extraordinary, unique human being as everyone is, that she's not going to miss out on being who she can be just because she has to miss out on motherhood. Basically, I want her to know it's going to be okay.
Wow, that's really beautiful. And Jody, please keep up your amazing work. We didn't have time to go into your TED lectures, but you've done 2 TED lectures. I haven't even done one. I'm very jealous. So 2 TED lectures. So I think everyone should listen to your TED lectures. They're absolutely brilliant, fantastic. And your book's there for support. And I know you're doing the audiobook soon. And you've got lots of blogs. You've written so much to help people. And yeah, your weekends, please, anyone who is relating to this podcast, please reach out to Jody and her team and don't experience this alone and get support. So thank you so much, Jody. That was such a really powerful podcast. I really thank you for giving up your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce.